Let's talk about whether this could be a reason why narcissistic behavior in the world seems to be getting worse, but maybe there's not more narcissistic people per se. So let's open up this video with a question. Are there more narcissistic people in the world? Or could there be something else going on? Frankly, we aren't sure. I know that anyone these days who's learning about narcissism or who's been through a narcissistic relationship is convinced that now you see narcissism everywhere and that narcissism has to be on the rise, and young people all seem to be more narcissistic than ever. And to many people, it's all this evidence that there's more narcissism. Well, there's various psychological phenomena at play here. There's stuff like something called confirmation bias. So once you see one thing, you start seeing lots of support for that one thing, and you start seeing more of it. You're more attuned, and in general, we're sort of looking for support for our hypothesis, and we find it. There's actually kind of only variable evidence that narcissism is on the rise. Some researchers suggest, yes, it is on the rise, and others, though, have suggested, no, not so much. Lots of the issue here relates to how difficult it is to measure narcissism in any sort of meaningful way. So there's really no great definitive evidence here. And then this idea that young people are more narcissistic now than in my time, well, I promise you this, your parents and grandparents said that about you. So this is a generational thing. Older folks tend to view younger folks as more selfish. Always have, always will. But I don't disagree, though, with this sense of something is going on out there. But I don't know if narcissism itself or the number of people who are narcissistic are on the rise. I remember a conversation I had with renowned narcissism researcher, Dr. Keith Campbell from the University of Georgia. And he thinks, and I agree with him on this, that grandiose narcissism is kind of holding steady. There's always been grandiose narcissists. But that vulnerable narcissism may be on the rise, and it's being expressed more than ever. And I kind of agree with him on that too. And some of this is that we now understand this subtype of vulnerable narcissism more clearly, and we can see it for what it is. I also think that historically, and now, we have always held a lot of space, tolerance, grace, and enabling for narcissistic people. I don't think we're that different now. It just plays out differently. In prior generations, a cold, remote, invalidating, unempathic, unavailable patriarch or father was normal. People who were in marriages being invalidated and emotionally abused was normal. It wasn't even taken notice of. It just simply was. It's something in research we'd call a cohort effect, like a lot of relationships were like that. Now remember, psychology is a very young field. Frankly, so is psychiatry. So things that once didn't really get acknowledged or addressed, like depression or anxiety, we talk about them now much more openly. We now much more clearly recognize the importance of early childhood experiences. And we talk about how adversity affects people into adulthood and how attachment matters and that trauma is really harmful. And all of this needs to be addressed. There was a time when childhood trauma was just written off as a part of life, and that the so-called cure was to not allow people to talk about it and just force them to just toughen up. I know it doesn't seem that way, but we're actually making a lot of progress in many issues related to mental health and development and well-being. But there's still this vexing narcissism issue. We hold space in our world for narcissistic people in a different way now. We reward them at a societal level. Loud, brash, shameless, arrogant, unethical, deceitful, manipulative, gaslighting, selfish, attention-seeking people are doing very well in the world right now. They are rewarded in politics, media, finance, most high-paying sectors. And because of social media, even regular folks are being rewarded for these behaviors in all kinds of ways. The more unhinged, superficial, vain, cruel, mean-spirited, self-centered content online gets eyes, and all of that turns into money, which turns into power. But I still think there is something else going on here, and it goes back to what Dr. Campbell said about the rise of vulnerable narcissism. That type of narcissism that is characterized by victimhood and grievances and passive aggression and disenchantment and irritability and anger and suspiciousness and this low-grade paranoia. Nothing's ever fair to me. Brooding, entitlement kind of narcissism. Not that charming, grandiose narcissism, but the socially isolated, isolating, always put upon sad sack narcissism that we see in vulnerable narcissism. And side note, if things go the way the vulnerable narcissistic person wants, they will sort of prance about as a grandiose narcissistic person, but they'll still be kind of paranoid about it. Now, I'm old enough, this is why it's good to be on this channel, because I am old enough, that when I was growing up, I only knew what the people around me had. You knew that some kids in school, their families had more money, their families had bigger houses. You saw them on the bus route when the bus would drop the kids off at, in their houses. Their parents drove slightly nicer cars. Maybe they took bigger vacation. I grew up in the 1970s and early 80s when there was a much more substantial middle class here in the United States. So most of us were kind of living around the same space. It was also clear which families were struggling a bit, but most of us were squarely in the middle. And the worst of it would be that we might see, remember the mean girl who would wear the newest designer jeans, or the mean jock whose mean dad bought him the new car when he turned 16, but that was about it. And you know what, again, lots of those mean girls and mean jocks peaked in high school, right? And became woefully ordinary afterwards once they hit adulthood. Most of the rest of us moved away, or at least did something with our lives. So here's where it gets, I think this to me is the sort of the inflection point. It's social comparison. Social comparison is a powerful thing. We are social creatures. We compare. We look at the friend's nicer lifestyle and we may wonder, what am I doing wrong? Or their higher salary, or their healthier relationship, or that they're in good shape, whatever it may be. We index by looking at others. We always have. It's what our species does. And maybe we'll look at a friend who's not doing as well as us in other ways and index against that. Psychological health means that we still do that. We're never going to not socially compare. But when we're healthy, we can take a step back, get perspective, and not get lost in a destructive rabbit hole of comparison. For example, we may feel a little down after seeing our friend's fab life, but that doesn't stop us from finding meaning and purpose in our own. So this healthy social comparison is not what happens for narcissistic people. And as we stop to think about what are the reasons that narcissism or narcissistic behavior feels like it's worse or feels like it's more or extra these days, I really think it comes down to social comparison. I mean, none of us like comparing ourselves unfavorably to someone, but it really gets under the skin of someone who's narcissistic. Think of all these narcissistic traits as switches that, until stuff happens in the narcissistic person's life to turn it on, may kind of lie more quietly. So the narcissistic person is difficult and annoying, but when the thing happens that turns on that insecurity switch, you cannot turn it off. For most narcissistic people, that's an ego injury or some form of shaming. And that, most often, for a narcissistic person, may come through social comparison. Now, in the last 20 years, the social comparison game changed monumentally. Once upon a time, like I said, growing up, I wouldn't know what a random person was doing in Indiana. But now, I can see every damn single detail of their lives. I can see every single detail of everyone's lives if I chose to follow them on social media. And since many, many people are sharing more socially performative details of their lives, great vacations, interesting experiences, great accomplishments, new things they have acquired, a happy relationship, looking attractive, I'm at the beach. Social comparison has leveled up to a whole new game. And in general, people with narcissistic traits are not coping well with this. I do believe that there were always vulnerable narcissistic folks in the world, those brooding, angry folks. And they were alongside them, grandiose ones, malignant ones, self-righteous ones. There have been lots of narcissistic folks in the world throughout history. But most of them were in what we can call closed systems, in families, marriages, workplaces, maybe in their community. the people in those closed spaces had to suffer with it. But now the barrage of imagery that pings the narcissistic people's entitlement may be driving what we see in the world. More and more angry narcissistic folks demanding more and more attention and doing more and more outlandish stuff to get it, or getting more and more aggrieved and rageful that they're not getting it. Their lives are not as good as other people. And then throw in there that stuff costs more money now, especially stuff that we need, rent and real estate, and that wages haven't kept pace. And people are seeing other people posting about their fabulous lives online. You can see where this goes, and it is not pretty, and I think it's really lit the rocket of narcissism. This genie does not go back into the bottle, and narcissistic behavior per se is never going to be against the law, unless it really crosses an identifiable line, and in most cases it does not. Being an asshole is not illegal. And while I am actually not convinced that there are more narcissistic people than ever, I do think we value narcissistic behavior more than ever. My guess is that that number of narcissistic folks is probably staying relatively steady-ish. It appears that people with these personality styles, though, are behaving more badly than ever. And that may be what we're seeing, and we can see more of it. That means for folks who are afraid of being hurt again, or want to be sure that you don't get ensnared in another narcissistic relationship again, discernment is everything. We also have a video on empathic discernment you can check out. You can be empathic and compassionate, but also be discerning. Think of a lion at a zoo. It's beautiful to look at. You may even feel sad that this beautiful animal is locked in a cage or in an exhibit, and maybe even want to save it or rescue it in your heart. But if you tried to go in there and let that lion out of its cage, you would be flayed alive. It's a similar principle. You can understand how sad and difficult it could be for someone to have a narcissistic personality, to always feel insecure, but you can't save them. That's their responsibility. And if you get too close or don't witness it realistically, you will get hurt. And the world has become a place where narcissistic traits are not only more celebrated than ever, but is also making them more visible and more noxious. Which means that you need to understand it, and also understand that not you, not me, not anyone is going to be the exception. Get too close and you will get hurt, especially nowadays. And frankly, everyone would do well with not going down that social comparison rabbit hole. It's not good for any of us. But when you think about it, again, just to bring this point home, it's not likely that there's more narcissistic people. It's probably a relatively steady number who are really getting much more activated and enraged in a way they didn't once before. Because that social comparison trigger for them, which is a very tender trigger for narcissistic folks, is resulting in more and more outbursts of anger and rage at the world. That's likely a lot of what we're seeing. And because we're also living in a world where those traits are rewarded, sort of the more unhinged the behavior, the more people are looking at it. And people can turn that into money. That it's emboldening this personality and a style the way it never has been emboldened. But for people saying, well, does that mean everyone's like this? Hell no. There's lots of wonderful, healthy, well-regulated, empathic, warm, compassionate people out there. They just may not be drawing the same kind of attention. And it's why we need to be very, very, very discerning, careful, and move slowly when we first meet someone. That's shiny stuff, charm, charisma, attention-seeking can be really compelling for a minute. But then you have to ask yourself, what makes this sustainable? And another sort of great life hack when it comes to understanding narcissism, pay attention to how the narcissistic person reacts to social comparison. For some of us, we might socially compare to someone. We all do it to some degree and say, ooh, I feel kind of insecure. Like, how is she in that such great shape? Or how is her kitchen so clean? And then we let it go. But when you see someone get really escalated, in the face of social comparison, or you see their mood very quickly shift at that point, pay attention. I can promise you this, whatever their journey is, it ain't going to be healthy for a long-term relationship. So probably not more narcissists, but definitely this problem of social comparison at this unbelievably universal level has taken a problem and lit a match under it. Thanks again.